Welcome to today's episode of Optimizing Live. Today we're going to be discussing our insights from a recent poll on AI adoption blockers. So Randy, what did we learn from the poll that you put out there on what people think is blocking their AI adoption initiatives?
Well, first off, because of the way LinkedIn polls work, we're running two halves to the poll because we have 6 options. So we ran the first 3 options that are in the strategy, data, and trust category, as we named it. And strategy came out the pretty clear number one. Not having an aligned strategy, and looking for things like maybe there are some shiny AI goals, but they're not directly linked to KPIs. And in my experience, having a goal like that, as long as it's a learning-based goal, like that's a good place to start. Yeah, let's learn. But if you can't pretty quickly connect it back to, what are the big drivers from a business perspective, that disconnect is going to potentially take that initial focus on learning and just kind of go down whatever road that isn't going to ultimately impact the business, which kind of relates to some of the questions we're going to ask in the second poll that we'll talk about later.
Yeah. Okay. So in the strategy piece, what were some of the outcomes that you got out of the poll? Percentage-wise, what was that the dominant response that we saw?
Yeah, we had 41% said lack of aligned AI strategy. So not a dominating lead. And to be fair, that's why we asked the question the way we did. What's the top blocker?
Yeah.
Most of the reaction was, well, it's really all of these, which I definitely believe. But we're trying to figure out what are we going to work on next to help organizations get unblocked. There's a lot of different things. We've got a lot of capabilities already in place, but where do we double down? And that's really the reason for this poll is we want to know where we can best help. So that 41% lack of aligned strategy, poor data foundations was next at 32%, and then change resistance and distrust at 27%. But absolutely, it's a bit of all of the above for sure.
Yeah. And I want to take a quick step back because you raised a good point that I think is worth sharing, is that we certainly don't have the answers. I mean, we're diving into this as consultants, as coaches, as professionals, and we're learning. So certainly we don't have all the answers, but I think the process for our learning is to not just based on our own experiences, but we're trying to learn from what others are doing. And I think that's one of the reasons we put the poll out there is we want to hear from others' experiences, combine those with our own experiences as we're learning as an organization. What does it mean to us as coaches and consultants? How are we applying AI ourselves? What are we learning? What are our own challenges? And I think that's a real key that everybody needs to just keep in mind for this phenomena that is AI and the rapid pace of adoption here, is that it's, there's so much to learn, but you can sit on the sidelines and just kind of wait for everything to evolve and be perfect, or you can roll up your sleeves and get in. And I think that's a critical thing I wanted to circle back on, is like we're in a learning process ourselves. And as we learn, we want to share what we're learning with others, but we also want to learn from others' experiences. So, for me also, one thing when you use the term blockers, a very common term, in the work that we do, what is blocking our ability to make progress? And for me, a blocker is a form of attention. And tensions show up in all forms, not just because of AI adoption. Anytime we're trying to make any significant change in an organization, there's going to be this natural tension that comes up. And, on the point of strategy, what I am seeing and learning is that tension from a strategic perspective is really born out of the uncertainty and the ambiguity that exists because things are moving so fast. I'm sure a lot of organizations are struggling with this concept of well, AI is just technology, so we'll let IT deal with it. I know a lot of organizations are taking kind of a holistic view of it, but I'm sure one of the tensions and the blockers that are existing from a strategic perspective is, among other things, because of the uncertainty and the lack of clarity around what does AI mean for us as an organization.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that I would add to that is we're a new organization with a bunch of maybe you would describe us as long in the tooth, grizzled veterans of just working with organizations to help them figure out what does better look like for us and how do we get there. And so AI fits a lot of the same patterns that we've seen and that is, if you really want to drive the right behaviors, that alignment is pretty critical. One of the things that is a big risk is not stepping back and looking at the larger system. So one of the things that we'll see is, and I'm just going to call out, symptom, my favorite symptom number one, proliferation of dependencies. We can't deliver anything without massive effort to orchestrate, to organize, to report on. We've got 7 different teams that need to be part of delivering this critical initiative. And I would argue that that's probably one of the top sources of empirical data. That's data just like smacking you in the face saying, you may have a structural issue that you should address. And one of the things that we've definitely seen a fair amount of is we ignore that as that's just how it is. That's the way we're structured. We can't change that. And so what do? We create all kinds of process band-aids. Governance becomes more and more challenging. We have to implement, checks and balances and more checks and more balances and more sign-offs and more escalation just to navigate this complexity that we intentionally designed into our system. And using AI to fix that is you're optimizing the Band-Aid. And so that connection to strategy, we would suggest, is zoom out and take a look. Where is your system already ripe for improvement? And that's one of the conversations that we like to drive and focus on as well. So I would throw that into the connecting it to an aligned AI strategy.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm going to peel apart a couple of those just real quickly. So, I was using the term tensions, and as you were describing kind of the Band-Aids, oftentimes when we have these organizational tensions, could be compliance, governance, kind of the tension there that gets created into autonomy and some innovation. So if we're looking to adopt AI, because it's so new and it's moving so rapidly, there needs to be a level of experimentation, a little bit of adhocracy, allow people to play with it a little bit. But if you're simply layering in more governance and compliance constraints on that, which probably have valid rationale behind them, but are they reducing and lightening that tension so that we can move forward, or are they actually weighing it down a little bit further? And it's different for every organization, but I think that's an important thing for organizations to pay attention to, is because this idea of trying an experiment or creating a pilot, those are pretty easy for organizations to wrap their head around. But when they start bumping up against any compliance or risk components of the organization, rather than negotiating some medium ground, they tend to just kind of lay in more governance on top of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, one of the other components of the poll was around data. So what are some thoughts around the data or the data readiness as a blocker?
Yeah, that's another big one. 78% of firms in a recent poll aren't ready for AI because of data quality, accessibility, or compliance issues. But I think the key message here is not being ready doesn't mean don't start.
Right.
So, finding what are some more more common, data sources that the security risks are very low, you can start there, and then you can start sort of layering on. Okay, what are the next sources of data that we need to be able to make the kinds of decisions that we want to make? How do we build that up? And one of the things I want to, give a shout out to Dan Graham, who's the founder of AI Product Guild and a partner of ours. Like, he's really leading the way around helping organizations figure that out. Come up with what is the strategy, how does data really plug into that? And we're likely to have Dan on a future episode and dig into that a little further, because you can start, but you can't get real far with the most valuable use cases without a strategy there. And we're partnering with him on building a solution to really help accelerate that and make sure that you've got the right architecture in place, the right data governance to be able to go faster.
Yeah. So the data part of the poll, there's, for me, when I was thinking about that, the first thing that I had to kind of parse out was there's a difference between building AI models and using them. So going back to the strategy level, so what is the strategic imperative here? Is it to build AI models? If so, huge data concern when you're talking about the strategy, compliance, et cetera. If you're simply using AI, it might be a different issue, right? So building AI models, whether we're talking about agents or we're talking about large language models or other things, is a very different and complex space when we're talking about data readiness, data accessibility, data authenticity. We do know that the chats like GPT and others do have a tendency to hallucinate if they don't have access to the right data. I've been using Claude a little bit more, and the first time I went to use Claude, I asked it a couple questions, and it was clear with me and said, I'm only trained up to January of 2025. So, if I ask it questions or if I challenge it with some recent data, it informs me that that's not built into its LLM, but it can go do that research. So I think when we're combining the strategic component, the data readiness component, part of it is answering that question of, what is our intent as an organization? Are we going to be building AI models and other complex things, or are we using AI? And because they have different implications in terms of our data readiness and our data governance.
Right. Yeah. One other thing I would add, I sort of alluded to this, but there's a term that I think helps visualize it. But identifying your use case, what's the problem you're trying to solve? What do you need to build for that? And two pieces. One tip. I go back to a technique I learned very early in my career, just SIPOC diagramming, right? Who are the suppliers of the information? What are the specific inputs? What's the process that happens? How do I take those inputs and turn it into an output? What are those outputs, and who are the customers? That kind of a mapping really helps you see the lay of the land. You identify your inputs and your suppliers, and then you can look at what's the minimum viable data set that would enable that process. If I want to AI enable it, let's look at what are the things that are not a security risk. We can start there, but that notion of a minimum viable data set is, I think, an important concept to think about. There's still a lot of all or nothing thinking out there. It's easy to get stuck. It's like there's 17 different data sources, and 3 of these are, we really only want C-level to have access to it. Well, you probably don't want to try and crack that nut all in one shot.
Right. And the third component of the poll, and you referenced earlier, you broke the poll up into three parts just because of the constraints of the platform. But the third component of the poll, I think, was around trust or change resistance.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I just briefly, I might disagree a little bit that trust and change resistance are the same thing. I certainly agree there's a relationship there. And as you know, Randy, I'm big on organizational culture, and that includes how do we deal with resistance to change, which I believe is a natural human response. But when I think of trust, again, that kind of opens up a lot of different components, right? So there's, do we have the trust within the organization? So if you're talking about psychological safety type of trust, can we trust our teams to effectively and ethically use AI? I know that was one of the big trust issues that as AI started to really become more talked about is, if you and I simply use ChatGPT to create some content and throw it out there without, really checking the sources, that sort of thing. So I'm curious about trust. So for me, when I think of trust, I'm thinking of psychological safety. Can we trust each other to do the right thing? The change resistance is, again, I think it's a human response to, I tried something before and I didn't really get a great result. So I might be reluctant to lean in, or there's something that might trigger a little bit of a response in me. But tell me a little bit more about kind of how you think about trust and resistance to change within this context.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think there's multiple lenses on the trust perspective. The first lens is trust on the tools themselves.
Yeah.
Like I AI enable something. Is it going to give me, a predictable response that's high quality, that I can take that and put it in the board deck and, not risk losing my job because the AI completely fabricated something. We hear stories like that all the time. The other aspect of that from a tooling perspective is I see this prevailing pattern that there's a pretty large percentage of organizations, and in another recent survey says only about 40% of people trust AI tools right now, whether that be inside your company or for your own personal use. But I think that those aspects are important. There's a different dimension of trust, though, that I think is certainly worth talking about. And this goes back to what you mentioned around the notion of psychological safety and culture within an organization. But do I trust that if I go build this game-changing AI capability that is a massive efficiency gain for us, am I going to have to let people on my team go? Am I going to get let go?
Yeah.
I think that is a even bigger, and I think it's a harder to see thing. There's, in many organizations, there's always some level of complexity it's tough to navigate. You've got people inside the environment that is their superpower. They navigate the complexity. Those are your go-to people. And when you're not sure like where the moving pieces are or how to unblock something, like those are the people that you go to, and they know how to navigate the system. And let's be honest, those are the people who I call them gatekeepers. And depending on how they're wired and what their values are, they might be in a position to do something that on the surface seems like a win with AI, but like they've sort of taken the real teeth out of what they could have done because they don't want to create something that might potentially replace them. So I think that aspect of trust is another important thing to consider.
Yeah, I agree there, and I think that's pretty much a global thing, right? So
Mhm.
whether we're talking about an AI adoption or some other significant change in an organization, that's a natural response to that.
Yeah.
But I also tying it back to the data, right? Can we trust the data? Do
Mhm.
we have trust in our ability to protect the data, et cetera? So I think, trust is a simple concept, but in this context, it has some complexity kind of built into it.
Yeah.
And now, if we zoom out a little bit and we look at each of those three potential blockers, right? So, our strategic alignment or clarity, right? So, again, if we don't have strategic clarity on why are we adopting AI, how are we going to be doing this, what are we going after, what's our aim? If we don't have the data readiness, the data confidence, the controls around that, and then ultimately the multiple dimensions of trust. So, you look at these three blockers on their own, they can have you dead in the water.
Mhm.
Certainly, if you combine these, which I would guess in my experience in most organizations, there's not a single blocker, right? There are multiple things working against our ability to succeed. Sometimes it's obvious and we see it. Other times it's kind of subconscious and it kind of sneaks up on us. But if we look at all of these three together, that can be a pretty formidable blocker. And
Mhm.
what I see, we've seen data over the years that's been fairly consistent when we talk about the term transformation, that so few organizations actually succeed with their transformation initiatives. And we're not going to go into all of the reasons why, but certainly if you look at these three potential blockers, and if you have any level of blocker for all three at the same time, that can really just completely derail any initiative.
Mhm.
Yeah. So, given that, what are some of your thoughts on some practical steps that organizations can start to take?
Yeah, I think the first thing, probably the biggest blocker I see is, I think blocker number one is around trust, because I've seen so many organizations that they can't even get to the point where not having an AI aligned strategy is the actual blocker, because they've not even given access to some of the most foundational tools. I had a client earlier this year, and we were in this big strategic meeting with 25 to 30 folks, and the meeting started off with a request that says, who can be scribe and take notes for this meeting? And I'm like, isn't that AI's job? And it's like, well, because of the industry it's like, that's a bunch of bull crap. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I don't care what industry you're in. If you haven't figured out, and this was 5 months ago, if you haven't figured out by Q1 of this year how to just unleash like the most basic
Right.
tools to transcribe and take minutes from meetings, you probably have a much bigger problem organizationally. So that would be my my thing is, I've seen so many organizations that are just stuck in the starting blocks. Like they can't even start the race yet. And I would say that's number one. It's like they would love to have an issue where they don't have an aligned AI strategy. They don't even know yet.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a great example of, going back to the example of trust of, is AI going to be displacing people, right? Is my role going to be taking over from AI? But the example you use is just so simple. So anytime we get on a video call, now it's just habitual for us. Like, hey, the note taker component is on. And so the rest of us can focus on the quality of the conversation and making sure that we're sharing and learning and not have to worry about, is there a scribe?
Yeah.
And so that's a great example of, is it quote displacing something, yes, but it's ultimately making us more efficient.
Mm-hmm.
And the barrier for that level of tool usage shouldn't be high, to your point, right? If we haven't figured out, the simple tools that we can use that are safe and efficient and allow, that person, let's say, Randy, you're going to be the scribe today. Well, now as a scribe, you can't really interact in that conversation because you're having to pay attention to scribing everything. And that's a very simple, but I still think impactful example to take a look at. So small little things like that can start to build, the confidence in the organization.
With one consideration.
Yeah.
There are always people who they love being the scribe, right? There's certain people it's like, that is not me. I am not wired that way, right? Like you ask me to scribe, my brain is in scribe mode, and I'll go back afterwards and go, why didn't I speak up during when that was because I was worried about scribing, right? Like I'm not
exactly.
There are people that, it's like that's how they stay engaged. So absolutely honor their humanness. If that's something they like to do, hold them accountable for making sure that what comes out of your AI note taker that it's accurate. Yeah. Create the win-win, right?
Yeah, exactly. So for me, as I was thinking of, all right, so we've got some insights from the poll. We're learning ourselves by doing. I've tried to kind of encapsulate how do we move forward with this, right? So yes, we have blockers. And one way to move forward, I kind of get this little mnemonic in my head, and it's simply educate, iteate, and validate. And the educate part, I'm curious. I don't have any empirical data. I have my own experiences. But I think education is obviously critical. And I will confess, a couple of years ago, as AI started to get talked about more, my initial thought was, well, I don't need to worry about it. I'm no longer technical. I haven't written a line of code in a long, long time. And I'll let other people worry about it. Right. And, eventually I wised up and said, well, I need to start educating myself. Even though I'm not a software engineer, I'm not a coder. I still need to learn what are AI's capabilities and how does it impact me. And so education, I think, is critical. And I encourage organizations, don't just think of this as the technology, right? This is something that has the potential to impact every nook and cranny of your organization. So we need to educate everyone, from senior leaders to middle managers to the individual contributors that are, doing the work and needing to embrace AI. But we also need to make sure that we're educating our non-technical stakeholders. And as we educate people, we start to build confidence that, we're gaining the understanding. And I think that goes a long way to address some of these blockers that we're talking about. So with better education, then, our strategies have more coherence. With better education, our concerns around data readiness, governance, et cetera, become more clear. With education, that trust starts to be taken care of a little bit more. And then as we start to iterate, I like to think in the terms of, think big, but act small.
Yeah.
Right. So I've talked to a number of my clients, past and present, and, a few of them are running some agile pilots, but they don't have a clear strategy of what's next. Right. They're running pilots because they know they need to. And they're probably going to learn a little bit, but my concern for some of those is that they may get that learning and then get the silo. And then lastly, the validate part. And again, this goes back to trust is, what is common in AI province is human in the loop, right? So if we have concerns about the data, if we have concerns about the accuracy or efficacy of what we're getting out of AI, then we need to have a human in the loop to make sure that we can validate these things. And I think these are really simple steps that can take, but I think they can help organizations at least start to address those blockers.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on some specific actions that organizations can take given these blockers?
Yeah, I love that, and I'm gonna amplify Joe's comment in the thread here on engage, learn, improve, enjoy, repeat. I love
Enjoy.
that.
I love it.
Especially the learn part. One of my favorite coaching tips for leaders is how can you more consistently ask in the conversations that you're in, what are you trying? What are you learning? I find, when you talk about like, how do you shape culture? I don't know what could be more impactful than reinforcing, we expect you to be trying new things.
Yeah.
We want you to learn things, and we want you to share what you're learning, right? You tried something and it failed miserably. Awesome. Share it, right? Let's celebrate it so nobody else does the stupid thing you just did, right? Like, that's a win. So that would be my focus, is learn, and as leaders, show up and ask, like, hey, what's, like, literally just ask, what's something somebody tried that failed miserably? Like, normalize that, make it okay, make it a safe thing in your environment.
So as we wrap, Randy, what's can you tease up what the part 2 of the poll is going to include?
Yeah, so part 2 is going to be more around implementation patterns, scaling challenges. And again, because the LinkedIn polling constraints only give you 4 answers, and we had 6, we're going to run round 1 and round 2, and then we're going to take the top 2 from each round and have a final round to see where everything stacks up. But really, we're just doing that to try and drive the conversation. This session is what I like to affectionately call a lightning round. It's only 30 minutes, even though we're coming up on 32, which that's okay. But be looking for that. We're going to launch the second poll within the next hour. So if you're watching this before Friday, August 22nd, the poll number 2 will be live. If you're watching it between the 22nd and the 29th, the final poll will be live. And if you're watching it after that, go to our site and see, what we're sharing, what we've built. That the whole goal for us is to build resources to help folks work through these blocks. And I think that's the key takeaway for right now.
Yeah, I agree. Again, we're learning as we're doing. We want to share what we learn with others, and we want to learn from others. So we encourage you to engage in the conversation, and feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn, follow us on LinkedIn, and keep an eye out for that poll. And also keep an eye out for the next episode for Optimizing Live. So with that, we'll wrap up for today's episode. Thank you all for joining or watching this post-production. Randy, as always, great engaging conversation.
Appreciate it, Richard.
Yeah, right on. Thank you.